Hello and welcome to Philosophizing through Badiou. My name is Norman Madras. I'm a professor of philosophy, among other areas. Currently, I'm director of Modern Global Research Institute, but I have spent over 20 years in academia, uh, teaching philosophy, working through Alain Badiou's philosophical system, and I'd like to offer in these upcoming classes a presentation of Alain Badiou's philosophy from his books, but in an extremely simplified form. What I'd like to do is make available to students who might only be starting a philosophy course, first semester, second semester, uh, what it is exactly that characterizes, distinguishes, and makes the philosophical system created by Badiou so incredibly innovative and so broad, uh, despite the different reactions that it has provoked, and there have been many reactions. I think many of these reactions come from a lack of patience in considering what his philosophical system allows us to think philosophically. And this is one of the things here involved is that Badiou's primary concern, I wouldn't say in all of the scopes of his life because I don't know him that well, but at least in terms of the philosophical system, is to reinforce philosophy's capacity to be relevant in our times. So this is one of the challenges that you will see appearing already next week when we discuss the moment when his system begins to appear in France. This is the late 1980s, being an event. L'être et l'événement is published in 88, and Manifesto for Philosophy, Manifeste pour la Philosophie, is published in 89. I was in France then, and I'd just like to add a couple of biographical notes about myself. I was in France then. I had gone to the Vincennes University, Université Paris 8, already in its second modality, which means that after the university was expelled from the woods of Vincennes to the northern suburb of Saint-Denis, which at that time was very distant. There was no direct metro line. You had to take a very long circuitous metro and then a bus route to the university. It was really pushed out to the margins as much as possible by the government that held the Paris, let's say by the government that was in control of the Parisian state, really. I mean, Paris is built up of 20 neighborhoods, right? 20 districts, let's say, arrondissements, in which you have mayors elected to each of the arrondissements, and you have the mayor of mayors. And at that time, that was Jacques Chirac, and there was a decision made very undemocratically, without consulting anyone involved in the university itself, to basically destroy the infrastructure of the university and already move all of the content of the university to a new site that was secretly being built. No one knew about it. It was nearly nearly a perfect plan. But in any case, I arrived in France to study with the hopes of studying with Gilles Deleuze. At the time, before internet, news took some time to reach us, and I didn't realize that Gilles Deleuze had to take his retirement in June '87, and I began my studies in October '87, already having been dispatched to his colleague René Scherrer, and then having had the opportunity of seeing Gilles Deleuze's lecture in, I believe it was November of '87, I invited Jean Boré to be my research director. But in any case, uh, in '88, the news started to circulate in the department about this new book that dealt with ontology. So here I'd like to, try to bring you all into the context and also explain, or at least share with you a few observations about how Badiou has been received into English. There are many fine commentators of Badiou in English. I won't go into them all, and they're all responsible collectively for having at least given this reputation to Badiou's philosophy as being one of the great accomplishments of the 20th century, at least the fact that two of its three most important publications have occurred during the 21st century makes it also one of the most engaging philosophical systems, if not one of the only philosophical systems currently being discussed in courses. And of course, one understands that this community of scholars, all of whom have either done their doctorates, their PhDs directly under Badiou's supervision, or having had Badiou participate in their PhD level research, are engaged by some of the technical and theoretical innovations specific to Badiou's philosophy. And these innovations, of course, are at a level that assumes full knowledge of the system. So this is really, this part of research on Badiou's philosophy is really at a high level, naturally so. In some sense, I include myself in this community. We have to show, we have to prove how Badiou's contribution, in fact, deserves recognition, deserves attention, which, to be not to be unfairly critical, has really lacked in the Anglo-American philosophical community. Badiou has been mainly received by the same channels that were open to conduct research in contemporary French philosophy during the 1970s and 80s. A current that recognized itself, at least at one point, as being representative of a certain post-structuralism. Okay? Now, one of the problems with post-structuralism as a designator is that it's only ironically received in France as describing what has been produced in France since, let's say, the early 1970s, which is usually where the term comes in. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about why a term such as post-structuralism became possible to attempt to classify a whole group of thinkers, mainly Parisian thinkers. And I'd also like to describe a little bit more what the context of 20th century French philosophy was. So we need to look a little bit into the history of the development of this thought, just to make sure that we are within its context. Because what I'd like to propose, in addition to reading Badiou from the text, that doesn't mean I'm going to read passages, but of course, part of teaching philosophy involves going to the text to at least show that your presentation is not completely outlandish. But I don't want to engage in any type of interpretation here, and particularly I want to stay as much as possible within the context of philosophy itself. Okay, I recognize that there is a Lacanian milieu that has been extremely important for bringing Badiou to the attention of North American audience. But they have also this, or let's say this milieu has also, in some sense, tried to appropriate Badiou and disconsider the importance of the philosophical dimension in his work. I mean, this is an engagement with philosophy and with the perpetuation of philosophy. I also recognize that there is a lot of political attention involved regarding Badiou, and this having to do with how he also identifies extremely strongly with Marxism and the continuation of Marxism, in particular Marxist-Leninism and Maoism. But once again, these are very local and specific types of discussions. What I want to discuss is his philosophy, and how he constructed a philosophical system. That's also going to bring me to focus on his work, especially from the mid-1980s onward. And that exactly is what we find lacking in those who attempt to make his philosophy already, immediately upon discussing it, something transnational. By contrast, many of the criticisms made against Badiou's philosophy as being Francocentric often come from these readers, which, to me at least, demonstrates a certain type of impatience with what's going on here. Because philosophers perhaps have failed to yield to one specific aspect of their work, which is that philosophical time cannot be reduced to that of the existence of an individual philosopher. So we come into this zone here where, for professional reasons, we find ourselves having to put pressure on philosophical systems to speak for us right away. And one of the reasons for which I've decided to engage in these videos, because my professional career has led me to work not only in French but particularly in Portuguese, teaching Badiou in Brazil. I'm not only teaching Badiou in Brazil because I'm a professor of philosophy as such, contemporary philosophy, but modern philosophy and then political philosophy. But I've had the opportunity to teach Badiou, and I've insisted on teaching Badiou at the undergraduate level as well. So, to me, the system, despite its encyclopedic nature, there are many references. And I was just listening to Badiou's last recorded lecture, and he reminds everyone that, to do philosophy, you have to also know a lot of other things. So this is it. I mean, sometimes this can seem very daunting, very, monstrous of a scholar to show knowledge in so many different fields. But this is the nature of philosophy. So, and this is what makes philosophy so fascinating for those of you who are starting and a little bit worried and a little bit and a little bit, a little bit worried about how much you're actually going to have to read. But of course, reading, as you know, is a very plastic and diversified activity. Uh, Even though many of the greatest philosophical systems or thinking systems are locked into these monumental books, it's really a shame to let the size of a book discourage you from extracting what the model is, because this is where things are really important in terms of philosophical terms. What is the functioning model that has been introduced? This is what makes philosophers original, and there aren't that many original philosophers during its very long history. So once again, coming back to this thing of the impatience of understanding in one's lifetime, uh, perhaps is something that one has to think about a little bit as they engage in the Cartesian meditation. So throughout these sessions, I also plan on giving you very specific bibliographical references, and I would like to take the opportunity already. I mentioned the text Adventure of French Philosophy, which has been translated into English. It now serves as a general introduction to a collection of essays published during the 1970s and 80s. But when it was published, when it was publicized, when it was presented in public, it was a conference, and then an article published for the New Left Review. This came on the heels of of an attempt made by Badiou at the end of his book on Deleuze, published in 1997, to give a general dialectical outline of the development of French philosophy, of contemporary French philosophy. This term, contemporary French philosophy, will require some commentary as well. So, in fact, instead of just building up various referential terms here, I'm going to go back to a simplified linear model to describe the development of French philosophy in the 20th century. But I just want to complete my thought in indicating to you as a very good reading exercise to at least read half of Manifesto for Philosophy. I'll come around also to describing a little bit Badiou's production, but what we're going to be focusing on, at least over the next few sessions, I'd like to open another parenthesis here and say that I want to limit all these sessions to up to 40 minutes, 40 minutes or less. So if these aren't perfect lectures, very nicely bounded, I would, I want to justify myself in that sense, that I want to let time determine the limitations of what should be said in a given sequence. Okay. But so over the next few sessions, we're going to be focusing on the construction and the nature of the first pillar of what Badiou calls being an event, and what I call simply his philosophical system. He completely defends the idea of having made philosophy into a system. Indeed, he defends the idea that philosophy can only reinitiate itself from the devastation it suffered in the 1980s, and I will get back to that as well, insofar as it encounters its vocation once again for expressing itself in a systematic form. Okay. I've published a lot on Badiou. Much of it has been in Portuguese. As far as I know, I'm still the only author of a comprehensive book on Badiou, even though it's not, it's by no means a very long book. In fact, it was partly meant as an introduction, but I didn't want to put it into simplified terms back then, so it was a already dense introduction to Badiou's system, and it was published in 2011 in Brazil. It's called The Multiple Without the One. And for some reason, yeah, it's still the only work that's been published in Portuguese on Badiou. Now, there are different works published in English also about his philosophy, although many of them are very localized. What I want to try to present in that book, which was one of the first introductions to logics of worlds, Logique des mondes, which is the second pillar of L'être et l'événement, is exactly how it works as a system. And also, I mean, I want to emphasize that when we speak here about, mathematics, we don't have to make it more complicated than it is, and it can be understood in rather simple terms. But that does not mean that one should relativize the fact that it proved to be necessary. Okay, so there are a few ideas floating around. Let me get back to the context of French philosophy, and I want to make this very clear that I'm making some observations today about Badiou's reception in the English language. I've played a part in that, having translated 2 of his books. But what I want to bring out in English is the French nature of his philosophy and the context in which Badiou's philosophical system developed in relation to France and with reference to French philosophy. So, when we speak about philosophy in France, once again, from the outside, from the Anglo-American perspective, let's say, there's a type of intolerable irony that one often finds addressed to more contemporary expressions in French philosophy. Let's say that as we see the structuring of the bibliography by which philosophy programs are taught in universities between Germany, France, and the United States and England, or Anglo-American countries, Canada included, where I studied. I did my undergraduate at McGill. I'm Canadian from Montreal. Right? What we find is a sort of common ground that is recognized up until the early 19th century. And at the beginning of the 19th century, things start to fragment, or at least to ramify. So what's the beginning of the 19th century? Obviously, it's the moment of Hegel. It's the moment of triumph also of German philosophy. It's the period in which German philosophy is producing by far the most innovative philosophy, and it'll continue doing so until the second part of the 19th century. Now, there are reasons for that in terms of France, like why wasn't there why can't we find really any substantial philosophies being constructed in France until the emergence of positivism and Auguste Comte's philosophical system, which is very important to at least be familiar with in terms of a possible reference for Badiou. Right? I mean, he actually cites Auguste Comte in his in his last lecture, which is from the beginning of March. And we, of course, hope very much that his seminar will continue, but for the time being, it's been suspended, of course. So, French philosophy is re-engaged in the late 19th century. But what's happening in the late 19th century also is the emergence of the sciences, the scientific revolutions, of which Thomas Kuhn, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, has spoken about a lot. Right? These scientific revolutions will spark, really at the beginning of the 20th century, a shift in philosophical occupation from dealing with metaphysics and even moral philosophy to dealing more specifically with what we should actually take away philosophically from these scientific revolutions. So we have scientific revolutions occurring in chemistry, and then in mathematics with the emergence of set theory, then with the emergence of propositional logic, right? So a logic derived from the axiomatization of set theory at the turn of the century, even though a little bit before, because you have these mathematicians starting to look into what are the reasoning processes involved from step to step as one engages in mathematical processes of inference, for example, of inferring within the context of a demonstrative argument. So what is the logic that is behind all this, and how can we make this explicit? And then the discovery is made, particularly by Gottlob Frege, that there is a common ground between thinking rationally on a more common theoretical context and thinking mathematically in terms of being engaged in inference. And then you have the emergence of various extremely innovative geometric mathematics, represented in France by Poincaré, for example. So I don't want to, suffocate you with names and references. I just want to touch on a couple of names here to show that, the great thinker and certainly the most celebrated thinker in France of late 19th century, early 20th century is Bergson, Henri Bergson, right? Whose attention, insofar as he's actually doing metaphysics, whose attention is to a cognitive dimension of human thought that will particularly make use of qualitative analysis to examine the formation of thought and consciousness, particularly. And he does this from mathematical objects, but he's particularly interested also in the dimension of memory, the contribution of memory to the formation of consciousness. Memory had not really been thought up until then, and we can see an interest being given to memory also in the emergent science of psychoanalysis in Austria, Austria-Hungary at the time. So this is the configuration. Bergson was invited to lecture at Oxford. There was communication, and then we get to the First World War already. The interwar period will see a continuation of the construction of philosophies that are particularly interested with these revolutions occurring in the domain of the sciences now affecting physics, and the emergence of the theory of relativity, and the discussions that are rather conceptual in form between Poincaré and Bergson and Einstein, and then the emergence of quantum mechanics. In the 1930s, also the emergence of computation. So computation being an extension of the revolutions affecting mathematics, but also mathematical logic. So in France, the thinker to have initiated the interest in absorbing these revolutions into philosophy is undoubtedly Leon Brunswick, someone who, of course, you will have to go out and look up to follow. The work done in these decades will gradually come together and form the groundwork for a philosophical approach that today is generally called historical epistemology, to make it distinct from the epistemological turn of analytic philosophy in the United States, particularly. Historical epistemology, and whose most prolific thinker is undoubtedly Gaston Bachelard. Right? So Bachelard Bachelard's philosophy will have an impact that will go beyond the Second World War, and the first generation of the students working on phenomenology, particularly, such as Michel Foucault, will recognize Bachelard as being an extremely important interlocutor. So here you have, in the 1930s, the emergence of historical epistemology. And Foucault, for example, Derrida, for example, will both come from historical epistemology, and historical epistemology will be part of the training Badiou and his generation receive, and continues to circulate in the way they organize according to a very distinct form of rationalism that's part of French philosophy, at least since René Descartes. The nature of the relationship they see as occurring between philosophy and other fields of research. Okay? So, to understand contemporary French philosophy, we have to understand the emergence of historical epistemology. Now, contemporaneous to the emergence of historical epistemology is the work of Edmund Husserl, the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl, and also the phenomenology of the first Heidegger. Husserl basically becomes a sensation in Paris after lecturing at the Sorbonne in 1929, and his lectures will be translated by the very young Emmanuel Levinas, published as Cartesian Meditations, which is one of the first ports of entry into phenomenology. Heidegger's Being in Time receives a partial translation in the 1930s, affecting readers such as Jean-Paul Sartre, who will take Dasein from the way that it will understand Dasein from the way it was translated as condition humaine, human condition. So we have a very singularly specific, singularly French understanding of existential phenomenology stemming from Heidegger, and we shall have a merger of Husserl's more historical works, particularly contained in the crisis of the European sciences. I'm talking about the actual project, not the specific. The last two lectures that he gave, called also the crisis of European humanity. I'm speaking about the crisis of European sciences and transcendental phenomenology. This book, almost destroyed, almost lost during the Second World War, will be translated in the 1950s, at least partially. And Derrida is instrumental in the early 60s in making one of the sections, The Origin of Geometry, or that is, The Origin of Mathematics, available in translated form. In fact, he will publish this and receive one of the most prestigious awards from the community of researchers working in historical epistemology, the Gaston Bachelard Prize, if I'm not mistaken. So here we can see, I'm just going to summarize rather quickly this first session. I think I'm going to have to give another session to continue describing the French context. I want to do it in very, basic terms. I don't want to get into the description as of yet, but I'd like to go slowly so we can easily situate landmarks, reference points, to see what's happening in contemporary French philosophy. Because if your point of entry into French philosophy is so-called post-structuralism, like mainly Derrida's philosophy, or even mainly Foucault's philosophy, Foucault's later philosophy, then you will have a lot of problem understanding what French philosophy is. Because it would seem that there was a type of rejection of science and an excessive focus on morality or even art. Whereas there is little doubt that what was being done in French philosophy in the middle of the 20th century is as concentrated on science as one associates to either the Cambridge school, at least in the early decades of the 20th century, or analytic philosophy. So I'm going to stop here on this point. French philosophy is intrinsically rationalist and intrinsically focused on science. Just read the beginning of Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and you will see the reference to one of the greatest and most innovative thinkers working in the field of the philosophy of science, which is the way one should understand historical epistemology, who is none other than Alexandre Koyré. Koyré, of course, is Russian in background, but his research, most important research, was published in France, and it will determine the way or the nature of the philosophy that is taught to the generation of philosophers first reaching university in the second part of the 1950s, of which Alain Badiou is a part. So thanks for listening this far. We're exactly at 40 minutes. I'm going to sign out, And the next session will be a continuation of my discussion here on the background to Badiou's philosophical innovations, and two lessons from now, we will get into Manifesto for Philosophy. So my recommended readings are Adventure of French Philosophy and the first half of Manifesto for Philosophy. And if you enjoyed this video and this introduction to contemporary French philosophy, do press that like button, subscribe to my channel, and have a look at what else is around here. A lot is in Portuguese, but there's quite a lot in English as well. Thank you. See you next time.